Okay, good to see you all. Good morning. Please remember that quiz number 1 is up on Canvas. I noticed that some people have taken it already, but most have not. So please do not delay. Try to get it done. You have until Friday evening, the end of the day Friday, to get it done. I think that's the only thing. Well, I started the assignment for paper number 1. I'll try to get that done as soon as possible so you can start uploading your assignments. Remember, paper number 1's not due until the end of the month, but nevertheless, I put that up under the assignments tab on Canvas. I don't know if it's visible yet, but I'll get it done and it should be visible. I think that's all. I don't remember anything else that I want to mention. Yeah. Check your emails. I should mention that I sent out some emails about the syllabus, so please check your emails and keep an eye on that. And yes, and I think I should have there should be all the readings should be under modules on Canvas. So they should all be there for you to do, the links to various websites, but also PDF files of any readings. Okay, I left off with the Tuskegee experiments last time, and I have a video that explains what they were briefly. So I'll play that for us. Syphilis, the Tuskegee experiments treating syphilis. There were high rates of syphilis in various areas of the country, and the National Public Health Service, as it's called, did a study to find out where were some of the highest rates of syphilis in the country, and one of the places with the highest rates of syphilis was a place, Tuskegee in Alabama. And so that's where they decided to do the study. I don't know if the fact that it had to do with a black population or that there was largely a black population involved had anything to do with it, but it has been seen for its racial overtones. And certainly the people who were involved in the study were not informed of what was going on, at least not informed honestly about what was going on. So here's a little video that explains the scene. See if I can. There we go. Whoops. Why is this going to go? Oh, wait a second.
In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis, and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.
Alrighty. Now, notice what he said there, being very specific. It was untreated syphilis. They were told that they were in a study and they assumed that there would be some treatment given because they were promised medical care, but they were not. It was completely untreated. They didn't give them any sort of antibiotic, any sort of medication that would have stopped the disease, because precisely they wanted to see how the disease would progress in these men, even if it progressed to death. They didn't tell them that, but notice that part of the benefits that they offered to these gentlemen was a burial stipend. Meaning that they would give them money to pay for their burial, which should have given them a little indication that something was kind of funny about what was going on. What would I need a burial stipend for? Oh, because syphilis can destroy your organs and kill you. So when this came to light, it scandalized a lot of people, because these men, not just for the racial overtones of what was being done to this black population, and how they were treated, and would other populations, say a white population, have been treated the same way, but there was the lack of informed consent. It was viewed as unethical, and they made no qualms about what they were doing. I mean, the results were published in peer-reviewed journals. And even in publishing the studies, they made no attempt to hide the fact that they were primarily concerned with seeing how the disease progressed. They were not concerned about treating these men who were in their charge. What were some of the results of this episode? Well, first they stopped it once people found out about it. Notice, once people found out about it, they stopped it. They suddenly realized that it was unethical, apparently, and they stopped the study. But one of the results of this was what's called the Belmont Report. Well, I should say, before the Belmont Report, the National Research Act, which was passed by Congress, and part of the National Research Act was the establishment of a committee to study the issue of ethics in the research done on human subjects. And the result of that committee's studies was this, the Belmont Report, which is on my other page here that I got to go to. Belmont Report, there we are, which was issued in 1974. And there's a picture of the cover of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report, Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research. So there was seen that there was a need, if the Nuremberg Code and the Helsinki Declaration didn't help, because those were already out there and those dealt with research, how to treat research subjects, but apparently that was not enough. We needed something else to deal with how human subjects should be protected if they choose to be part of a research project. So this commission was created to outline principles that must be used during research on human subjects. And they came up with, in its report, the Belmont Report, they outlined 3 basic principles for all human subject research, and that would be respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These were seen as the 3 basic principles you needed for performing research on human beings. Last time, what did I say here? Respect for persons, beneficence. There we go, yes. Beneficence and justice. So the first one, an essential recognition that you are dealing with people who have free will, who have freedom of choice, who have responsibility, and that should be respected. If they choose to be part of the study, they should be fully informed about what's going on. The fact that there might be placebos used, which is in essence saying that you might not be treated. There might be aspects of the research that might be where you're a subject of non-treatment. You're in a control group, for example, and you might be given a drug that you're not told whether it's going to be the drug that will treat you or it's a placebo where it does nothing to your body. but you should be told. So the respect for the human person, beneficence, which is doing good to the person, that you're not trying to harm the person. You're giving them, say it's a drug study, and you give one group the drug and you give the control group a placebo. You don't give them another drug that might harm them. Okay, you give them something that will be non-harming, even if you don't tell them that you're giving them the placebo. So you're still looking out for the good of the person, which was not done in the Tuskegee experiments. They were not looking out for the good of the subjects because they knew that the progression of the disease, if it were allowed to progress to a certain extent, could cause irreparable damage to their bodily organs and even death. And the fact that they could pass it on to their wives, and their wives, if they got pregnant, could pass it on to their children, to the fetus, and the principle of justice, that you give what a person is due. A person is due the information. A person is due the proper respect of being a human person, and of a person who has voluntarily offered himself or herself to be a research subject. So they're due the information, that respective information, and knowing basically knowing what's, to a certain extent. I mean, you can't tell them everything that's going on because you have to have a control, and you have to have some sort of blindness to the study so that the results have integrity. But you inform them that that's the process, so they understand the process. What's the scientific process that's going on? Injustice. They deserve that information, have a right to that information out of justice. Why? Because you would want to know that information if you were involved. The study came out in 1974, and an effect of the study was an effect for bioethics, because it influenced the publication of a groundbreaking book. Whoops. I'm going to skip over. I'm not going to, I want to get through this today, so some of the things I'm going to skip over. Don't worry, if there's anything that I skip over, it will not be testable, so it won't show up on a quiz. If I don't discuss it in class, don't worry about it, even though it's on the PowerPoint. If I don't discuss it in some depth or at all, then I will not test you for it. I will not ask a question on the quiz, okay, just so you know. So I'm skipping over one slide. I'm skipping over this slide because I want to get to this, which was kind of a result of the Belmont report, how it influenced the field of bioethics. The publication of this book by Tom Beauchamp and James Childress in 1979, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. Notice they don't call it bioethics, they call it biomedical ethics, but it's the same thing, same difference. And right now, this is what's in its 7th edition. It's still can be used as a textbook in class. Hold on one second. Mr. Saravo is here, and Mr. Thatch. And Ms. Pullman's here. Okay. Mr. Thomas. I haven't seen Mr. Thomas, so we'll see what happens. This book came as an outgrowth of the Belmont report, what to do. And ethical issues were becoming, especially in the last few decades, more and more central, and questions were being asked that were beyond, even bigger than medical questions. But how do we treat animals? How do we treat the environment? So the Belmont report especially led to the publication of this book, and they featured 4 bioethical principles, which we're going to talk about later when we talk about principles of bioethics, because you will encounter these principles almost certainly. And these were the 4 principles of autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Okay, so we see here beneficence and justice are 2 of the principles, and they add autonomy, which you could also say is respect for the human person, but autonomy, and they add another one, non-maleficence, which means don't do any harm, do no harm. And I'm not going to write them on the board because we'll talk about them later when we talk about principles of bioethics. Bioethical programs and degrees begin to be set up in the United States during the 1970s and the 1980s. So we see the institutionalization of bioethics. People start studying it as its own proper subject and apply as its own proper subject. But then, let's go to the next slide here. Oop, we did that. Developments in medical technology spurred on the need for bioethical thinking because whereas before it was, say, the Nazi experiments or the Tuskegee experiments, so experiments on human subjects, and the focus was largely on research and how to respect the dignity of the human person who is involved in research. But it starts during this time period, I guess you could say with the 50s and the 60s, you start having the development of modern technology, which was not available at the time, was not available previously. Technologies like, you have respirators, you have kidney dialysis machines, you have intensive care units, dialysis machines, you have intensive care units, you have organ transplantation, et cetera, et cetera. These things were not available in, say, the 1940s, okay, when the Nuremberg Code came out, and which was focused on research anyways. But you start seeing the development of these things which could prolong human life, even save human life from what before might have been deadly circumstances. So you have ethical questions of how to, or when and how human life should be preserved and whether it should be preserved, end of life issues, which were not so much a question before. I mean, basically before that, the technology wasn't there, you probably died, and they gave you palliative care. They prepared you for death. Before they didn't have any antibiotics. When they started having antibiotics and they could treat you, they could maybe bring you back from death and cure you of a virus or a bacterium that was attacking the body. But now that they started having medical equipment, this raised all sorts of new questions.
It's just that this isn't really what I expected. Most of my patients are older and sort of checked out mentally.
Pumpkin. That's modern medicine. Advances that keep people alive who should have died a long time ago, back when they lost what made them people. Now, your job is to stay sane enough so that when someone does come in that you actually can help, you're not so brain dead that you can't function. For the love of God. What?
Do you think we should be talking about
Her? She's dead. Write this down, Libby. If you push around a stiff, nobody will ask you to do anything.
You've been like a father to me.
Fair enough.
Okay, just a little clip from the television show Scrubs, where in a rather coarse way, Dr. Cox, who this is JD. I forget his first name. They just call him JD. But Dr. Cox is kind of his mentor and the person he looks up to. This is from, I believe, the first episode of Scrubs, which is a comedy about doctors at a hospital, obviously. And he's explaining the miracle of modern medicine, which, as he describes it, is people who should have died a long time ago are being kept alive by all these machines that we've created. It's a coarse way of putting it, but that is not an inaccurate way, because it has raised ethical issues. This is a quotation from a book called Nursing Ethics. So I know a number of you are in the are going to be in the nursing field or preparing for the nursing field, so maybe you'll come across this textbook. But Nursing Ethics Across the Curriculum and into Practice by Janie Butts and Karen Rich. Quote, with these advances also came increased responsibility and distress amongst healthcare professionals, because it raised other problems, dilemmas that you might ask. I mean, if a person's brain dead, but a respirator can keep the body still going, what are you doing? Are you keeping a corpse alive? It raises dilemmas like that. Patients who would have died in the past began to have a lingering, suffering existence. Healthcare professionals were faced with trying to decide how to allocate newly developed scarce medical resources. Okay, who gets the respirator? The person who's brain dead or the person who is conscious and whose brain is working? I mean, that might seem like, no pun intended, a no-brainer. But it is a question. You have to make these questions because maybe it's not someone who's brain dead, but someone who has a rare disease that is probably terminal. Do you do everything? Do you try to do everything you can to preserve that person's life as opposed to someone who's not terminal? Well, probably not. That might be obvious to you, but it's not always. It certainly might not be obvious to the terminal patient who wants to stay alive. I just, in fact, just yesterday saw an issue in the United Kingdom. I mentioned the United Kingdom before in the National Healthcare Service, and there is a woman who has a degenerative disease or mitochondrial degenerative disease. I guess something in her cells is not producing energy, and so cells are dying out throughout her body. So and it's terminal. There's no cure for it. There's nothing they can do for it. And she's gone through respiratory failure a number of times, but she's fully conscious and competent. She can communicate and talk, and she wants to do everything to treat the disease. The doctors, on the other hand, have decided that since the disease is untreatable, there's no cure, and trying to treat the disease would really be futile. And they've told her this, that they will override her wishes and they will move her to palliative care to die. They will not resuscitate her if she has a respiratory arrest again, contrary to her wishes. She's told them explicitly that she wants to be revived, but they won't do it. And this case went to court in the United Kingdom, and the court sided with the doctors, basically because the rationale was, even though the woman is competent and she is conscious and she can communicate her wishes, nevertheless, she doesn't believe what her doctors are telling her. She doesn't want to believe that what they're telling her, which is basically, you're dying. This disease is completely terminal. It's incurable. There's nothing we can do other than to make you comfortable and expecting death. So the woman has some idea of going to Canada for some experimental treatment, but they won't allow that. I don't know how they can block her from doing that, but apparently they can. Her doctors can not allow her to leave, at least in the United Kingdom. So these are issues that come up. This person, these are ethical issues that come up even as of yesterday when I read the article. You're faced with these issues of, what do you do with your medical resources? Do you keep trying to fight this illness that you know is going to win in the case of this woman? Or do you accept the fact that the treatments will be futile and you just prepare the patient for death? The doctors have chosen to prepare the patient for death. But these issues come about because of, in some cases, because of the medical technologies we have, that we do have experimental treatments which might work, but they're experimental. We do have respirators. We do have heart-lung machines that can keep maybe the physical body going even when there might be total brain death, or whether the fact if you took off the respirator, the person would not be breathing. The person would asphyxiate and die naturally. But we have these technologies. So the questions then come with the technology. Do you use them? And who deserves to have them used on them? Some developments in bioethics from a Catholic perspective that I could call out would be, first of all, 1985. We have the motu proprio letter of His Holiness Pope John Paul II, Dolentium Hominum, the suffering of men, or the suffering of human beings. Great title. Thank you, Holy Father. Could you give me something more positive to work with here? Anyways, A motu proprio, just in case you're wondering, is a letter. It's a special kind of letter from the popes. It means it was done on his own initiative, proper to himself, proprio, proper to himself, motu. So motu proprio, letter dolensum hominum. What did this do? This instituted the Pontifical Commission, which later became the Pontifical Council for the pastoral assistance of healthcare workers. Healthcare workers. Okay, so that was a development. The council actually, just to update you on what's gone on, His Holiness Pope Francis has kind of reshuffled things within the bureaucracy of the Vatican. I mean, the Vatican has a large bureaucracy, and he has created the dicastery for promoting integral human development. A dicastery is just a fancy term for a bureaucratic office, okay, at the Vatican. And integral human development means promoting the wholeness of the human person. Okay, so there's an office for basically promoting the wholeness of the human person, and within this dicastery, he decided a number of years ago to dump a whole lot of these little commissions and committees and councils, one of them being the Pontifical Council for the Pastoral Assistance of Healthcare Workers, and dump them all in there. So technically, the Pontifical Council that I'm talking about doesn't exist anymore, but it did exist in 1985 and for a number of years, up until recently. It was only a few years ago, within the last maybe 3 years, I think, that this occurred. Anyways, how is the Pontifical Council described? And this gives us a sense of where the church is, or where the church was in creating this. This is from an Apostolic Constitution, Pastor Bonus, which is kind of like a legal document. It's almost like the American Constitution. An Apostolic Constitution operates the same way. It describes governmental structures within the church. So in the section that describes what the Pontifical Council was all about, it says, it shows the solicitude, the care, solicitude is just a fancy word for caring, of the church for the sick, by helping those who serve the sick and suffering, so that their apostolate of mercy, and apostolate is another fancy word for their service of mercy, you could say, may ever more effectively respond to people's needs. The council is to spread the church's teachings on the spiritual and moral aspects of illness, as well as the meaning of human suffering. So that's where the Catholic Church is coming from. It's a religious institution, so it is seeing illness and suffering from a moral perspective. And hence, courses like this, Bioethics is doing the same thing. It's ethical. You could say it's moral. And so it's looking at suffering and illness from the same kind of vantage point, from a moral and ethical point of view. Is there anything else I want to... number 2, the council lends assistance to particular churches to ensure that healthcare workers receive spiritual help in carrying out their work according to Christian teachings. Okay? So there's that concern that seeing that, notice, it's not the Pontifical Council for the sick. There are other avenues for that. This was seen as a need for healthcare workers themselves, to give them guidance in church teachings, but also give them pastoral care that, they're serving the suffering and the sick, but the people who are serving them, ministering to these people, the nurses and the doctors, and the other clinicians themselves might also need care. Right? So they don't burn out or they don't go crazy, or as Dr. Cox says in Scrubs, so you don't lose your mind. You can keep yourself sane so that you're at a spiritual and mental state, a professional state, where when someone comes in who truly has something that needs to be treated, you can treat that person. Other developments from a Catholic perspective are the issuance of this document, Donum Vitae. I think I was going to have you read it, but I think in my revision of the syllabus, I took Donum Vitae out and kept the next one, or the one at the bottom in 2008, Dignitas Personae. mainly because Dignitas Personae repeats a lot of the same ideas of Donum Vitae. But nevertheless, I put it down there anyways, 1987 Donum Vitae, because it addresses moral issues pertaining to human life and procreation specifically. So we have, it doesn't use the word bioethics, but it is one of the first documents by the church to start addressing various medical technologies that have arisen, the morality of various medical technologies that have arisen in regards to creating human life, sometimes within the person of the woman, sometimes out in test tubes or petri dishes, and whether those are moral or not. In 1982, John Paul II instituted the World Day of the Sick, or 1992, excuse me, 1992, to be celebrated. It's celebrated annually on February 11th. Did I give a quote where he describes what it's about? Yes, I did. So I'll come back to that in a second. I just have a quotation from the letter in which he instituted this World Day of the Sick, his message on that first day. In 2008, so not that long ago, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued Dignitas Personae, which deals with, it specifically says in the title of the document, on certain questions of bioethics. So here we have the church finally using the term bioethics in 2008 and dealing with a lot of the same kind of life issues, procreative issues that were dealt with in Donum Vitae, which is, as I said, why I decided not to have you read both documents. Donum Vitae is longish anyways, so if I can kill two birds with one stone, Dignitas Personae kind of covers the issues as well and refers back to Donum Vitae anyways, so I do that. Although I do give you both documents on Canvas, in case you want to take a peek at Donum Vitae if you're curious. Why did the Pope institute the World Day for the Sick? Well, he tells us in his first message on the first annual World Day of the Sick back in October 22nd, 1992. Yes, didn't I say it should be on February 11th? Yeah, well, the Vatican works according to its own timeline. You just got to go with it. All right. Whoops. Does anyone want to read this? Like to read this this quotation from the Pope's message? Anyone interested? Da-da-da-da-do. Da-da-da-da. I could throw out some extra credit points. Oh yes, that got some head movement. Oh, did I hear extra credit points, Dr. Dunn? Ms. Pullman, go ahead.
The World Day of the Sick is happened to be year external initiatives, however praiseworthy they may be, but it's intended to reach consciousness to make them aware of the valuable contribution which human and Christian service to suffering makes to better understanding among people and brings it to building real peace. Indeed, peace presupposes as a preliminary condition for special attention to the suffering of the sick by public authorities, national and international organizations, and every person of goodwill. This is valid, first of all, for developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which are marked by serious deficiencies in healthcare. With the celebration of the World Day of the Sick, the Church is promoting a renewed commitment to those populations, seeking to wipe out the injustices existing today by devoting greater spiritual and material resources to their needs.
Okay, thank you very much. And for that, I'll give you one extra credit point to your final grade. Okay, so the World Day of the Sick. What does it have? What use does it have for our purposes to reach consciences and make them aware of the contribution which human and Christian service to those suffering makes to better understanding amongst people and to peace? Okay, so it's a matter of consciences, moral decision making. Right? He makes that connection between sickness and the questions that come with sickness. Okay, how we treat the sick, how should they be treated, and a human and Christian service. So it's not just he recognizes that there is a specifically Christian service that can be given to those who are suffering from illness. There's not just a secular human aspect to it. But there is an aspect that comes from the following of Jesus Christ, which is why I'm going to spend, I think, 4 classes talking about the background to a Catholic bioethics and why, what does the church bring to this field of bioethics that is different from, say, just a humanistic viewpoint. The response to suffering is related to the building of peace. And I think this probably goes to the idea of how we treat others, especially those who are the most vulnerable. Okay, leads to real peace in the world. It's not just the absence of war or the absence of conflict, but how do we treat those who are in a position of vulnerability? Peace preserves that special attention be reserved for the suffering and the sick. And since I already made the point, I won't make it again. But I think that's the point he's making about how we treat each other, and especially how we treat those who are most in need of help. And he refers to injustice. Part of his World Day of the Sick was to place a focus on the fact of the many places in the world, mostly in what's called the 2/3 world, say Africa, South America, Asia. There are many places where people don't have access to health care, or at least not sufficient health care or good health care. And I can speak for that. When I lived for 9 months in Papua New Guinea, healthcare was a big issue because the nearest hospital was in the capital, which was not too far where I was living from, but it was the place you went to die. You didn't go there to get better. The joke was 2 weeks. It was the play. That was your medical care. 2 weeks. Everything was 2 weeks. You go to the hospital. And they had universal health care, by the way. So they were, in a sense, beyond us in that aspect, at least in their mindset of people should be getting free health care. So, yeah, you show up in the morning, you stand in line, you go, you get your tests, and some doctor looks at you and probably just does that because they probably don't even have stethoscopes. They can't afford them. The government pays for everything, and the government never has any money. So they probably just look at you like Hippocrates would have done over 2,000 years ago. The meta is there's not much you can do. And maybe they will run some tests. And then the joke is 2 weeks. We'll come back in 2 weeks. You come back in 2 weeks. If you come back in 2 weeks, they tell you, oh, come back in 2 weeks. Okay, so you come back in another 2 weeks. Oh, yeah, come back in 2 weeks. We'll have those tests for you. Huh? Yeah, so you start getting wise to it. They're never going to have the tests, so what do you do if you have cancer? You don't get treated. Basically, they can say, okay, you have cancer, but you don't get treated. They don't have the money. They don't have the resources. So it's a place you go to die. So there is this system of injustice in many places of the world where the sick and the suffering are not able to get the treatment that they need, as opposed to there are places in the world where you have it all over the place. You have it. We have healthcare in this country if you can afford it. We have healthcare in this country for people who need it and want it. And in other places in Europe where they have universal healthcare, you don't even have to pay for it. And you go to the doctor when you're sick and you get treated, for the most part. So he references that. He wanted to bring that to the world's attention, the injustice of healthcare, that there are people who are vulnerable from sickness and suffering who cannot get their needs met because of just where they live, the places of the world where they live, and that there should be a concern of countries. We should all be concerned, not just that we have healthcare for ourselves, but we should be concerned that other people in other parts of the world have healthcare for themselves as well. This is part of the promotion of peace between countries, helping people out who are sick and suffering. At least that's the motive for the World Day of the Sick. These are just some, I will mention that. Okay. I'm not going to mention all of these developments, but some recent developments which have again kind of crystallized and focused bioethical controversy or bioethical questions are, for example, 1990 and 1998, Nancy Cruzan and Terry Schiavo. I'll talk about them later when I talk about euthanasia and end of life and letting die. These are really end of life issues. These are two women of different scenarios. They were not the same situation, but basically, should they have been let to die, or should they have been kept on equipment that have kept them alive? In the case of, I believe in the case of both of them, it had to deal with feeding tubes. So there was a commonality there. Does medical care for a person who is, say, basically brain dead, has no brain function, certainly that does not necessarily include doing extraordinary things for them, like, do you have to keep them on a respirator forever if they have no brain function and they would just naturally die? But should you at least feed them and give them water, food and water, if they can survive, if the body can survive on those things? Those were the issues in those two cases. So those were ethical issues that had arisen. And a couple of cases that have come up are in regards to transplantation, and these are very recent. We have a pig. Well, I shouldn't say what year was that. I didn't catch the year. Well, there have been a number of transplantations involving pig organs. I have here on the PowerPoint kidneys. Well, I have here the kidney transplanted into a brain dead man in 2021. It wasn't, I shouldn't say into the brain dead man. He was brain dead. They kept him alive with a respirator, kept the body alive with a respirator, I should say. And the kidney wasn't actually transplanted into his body. The pig's kidney was, I think it was connected to his body around the thigh or the hip region, and they removed his regular kidneys and attached the pig's kidney to whatever the organs or the whatever they needed to, so that the kidney could function, and it did function. But this was experimental. The man was brain dead. He wasn't going to recover. They wanted to see if they could actually make the kidney work, if the pig's kidney would work as a regular kidney. Would it be rejected by the body? It's questions like that. In 2022, a man received a pig's heart, which have been genetically modified. In each of these cases, they have to genetically modify the animal organ. Why? Well, they have to modify it because of rejection. The body recognizes that it's not a human organ, and so it can attack it. So they have to modify the genes of the pig in the first place to make it more acceptable to the human body. Now, the body it will make it less likely that the body will reject the organ or attack it with white blood cells or leukocytes or whatever, but not necessarily. You still have to be vigilant on that. There still can be rejection issues, but it makes it less likely that there will be rejection issues. So a man received a heart transplant in 2022. I don't believe he lived very long from it, but then he was very sick to begin with. So, whatever, but they did do it. I think it was the University of Maryland. So I mentioned the transplants first. For the issue of abortion, we have 2022 Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. I didn't mention Roe v. Wade before, but 1973 Roe versus Wade. But I'll mention the most recent decision because basically it overturns Roe versus Wade. So Roe versus Wade is not part of the abortion decision of the Supreme Court back in 1973, is not part of precedent anymore. Dobbs and Jackson Women's Health versus Jackson Women's Health Organization would be the controlling precedent for now. And what does this do? This basically said that there was no right to abortion in the Constitution, but that the issue should be referred back to each individual state. So each individual state, through the elected representatives of each individual state, should make a determination on whether abortion should be permitted and at what instance the abortion should be legal, what stage of pregnancy. So basically that's what it did. It did not end abortion necessarily because, well, you still have states that, well, most states have abortion still, but some states might have more restrictive laws now, and some states have totally free access, as was the case under Roe versus Wade. So that raises ethical questions. Ethical question, not just the general ethical question of abortion itself, but of well, I guess you should say it raises the question of abortion itself, but the right to abortion and what connection it has to a woman's health care. So those issues come up. So those ethical issues are still with us. All right. I think that's the last thing I have on this PowerPoint. And, oh, good. Went faster than I thought. Very good. So I'll open up the next PowerPoint. Should be principles. Okay. Which means I gotta get out my other copy of the notes. What is bioethics? It's principles of bioethics. There we are. All righty. Whoops. Introduction. Well, thank you. All right. This is a quotation from John French in an article he wrote called Introduction to the Principles of Bioethics in the Canadian Journal of Medical Radiation Technology. So a shout out to all of those of you who are doing radiology, holla, okay? This guy's one of yours. And so he wrote this article, and I thought this quotation was appropriate. He says, most healthcare professionals, HCPs, including nurses, physicians, and those in the professions allied to medicine, which would be something like radiology, including medical radiological technologists, are confronted with ethical issues on a daily basis. These so-called, quote, everyday ethics permeate healthcare and require careful consideration in order to be optimally resolved for all concerned. Failure to resolve these issues can result in suboptimal patient care, conflict with patients, families, and HCPs, and have a negative impact on the well-being of those involved, including both patients and HCPs. So bioethics in general and medical healthcare ethics in particular are complex systems. I mean, the healthcare profession combines extensive theory with intensive practice. In other words, it's hard. As anyone who is going through the process of nursing or radiology or wants to go on to medical school understands. This is a hard field. There's a lot to learn and there's a lot to do. Healthcare practitioners need to have prepared themselves for moments when they encounter ethical issues. They need to have some sort of principles in hand, mentally speaking, that can guide them, at least in general, for how to deal with ethical issues. You don't want to have to fly by the seat of your pants. You want to have already, you don't have to think about every issue that comes up because that's just not possible. I mean, but you don't want to be caught flat-footed when you are confronted with an ethical issue. Hey, that's an ethical issue. You recognize that in your practice. You want to feel comfortable enough within yourself to recognize that you're encountering an ethical issue, and then that you have some tools to address the issue, that you're not just, making it up as you go along. Why? Because that can, as French says in his quotation, that can lead to conflict. In other words, it can make people angry. They don't think you know what you're doing, that you haven't thought about how to care for them. You're just deciding on your own, well, we'll do this, or you have no answers for them. A person might ask you, and this happens all the time. People ask, very deep moral questions sometimes about their care. And if you have no answers, why should they trust you about what you're going to do to them? Maybe you're just going through the motions, it appears. Or you don't care enough to address those questions. And you want to be comfortable with the questions because they are hard questions. People care about them. And so people can you can get very excited very quickly about and lose your mind in a way, lose your rationality in trying to discuss these issues when what you need is to be rational, to be somewhat dispassionate, so you can look objectively at what the question is or what the ethical dilemma is and how to deal with it. So you're not dealing with it on the fly just out of emotion, which is an easy way to do or say something wrong. And it's a quick way to get into trouble. Get reported to the ethics board. You know what the nurse said to me? So a principle is a comprehensive and fundamental law, rule, or assumption. It comes from the Latin word principium, which simply means beginning or origin. So we're dealing with principles, we're dealing with origins, the origins of thought, the origins for action, what we're going to do about something. It is a rule or a code of conduct. It's the fundamental assumption of how to act or what something is. And a person in the medical profession or dealing with bioethics should have some principles at hand, just as readily and immediately as, you have your stethoscope or medical equipment. I showed you a clip from the first episode of Scrubs. Also in that episode, I'm not going to show it to you, but JD is scared to run IVs on patients. He's like looking at the person's arm and he's like, okay, just stick this long needle into the person's vein. And he can't do it. For some reason I don't know why he can't do it. I'm sure he had to do it in medical school. He had to learn how to do it. But he can't, the joke is he can't run the IV, so he lets the nurses do it for him. They know how to do it. But he's a doc. He doesn't want to do it. And that makes him an inferior doctor. Who could possibly get fired for it? In fact, the comment when JD says at the end of what I did show you in that clip, JD says, you've been like a father to me. What does he say? Yeah, he says you've been like a father to me. Dr. Cox turns to him and says, well, let me tell you something. You want honesty. Nothing's going to get you kicked out of here so fast as if they find out that the nurses are doing your procedures for you. So he could get fired for it. He's not doing his job. In the same way, analogously, is a healthcare practitioner, a healing professional who refuses to entertain ethical issues, because you're going to hit into them all the time in your practice. Bioethical principles are not an add-on to the practice of healthcare. It's not just some useless philosophy or humanities mumbo-jumbo that's given just another class that the medical school can charge you for, or Gwynedd Mercy can charge you for. Med students, and let me just see if, okay, come on, med students, nurses, radiologists, dentists, etc., have to sit through long classes learning the theory and principles of their craft and art. So you already are committed to learning principles. You have to learn principles. This is just another course in principles. There's just different types of principles. All right. It's not the principles of biology or, learning about cells or learning about the development of diseases. It's learning about the thinking faculty. How are you going to think as an ethical physician or an ethical nurse? You need to learn principles for thinking ethically and morally. And theory gives guidance and prepares for practice. Theory gives guidance and prepares for practice. Practice is also important because it sharpens the theory. Okay, once you start to really encounter these ethical questions, that puts the theory into practice and you start to see, okay, this works in the theory and maybe this doesn't work in the theory. Okay, the same way in practicing medicine. You start, stuff that you learned in medical school, you learned in nursing school, you learned in radiological school or whatever, radiological program, I guess. okay, this is what I was taught, but now I'm out into the real hospital and this works and this doesn't work. And nurses and people, and medical professionals will kind of give you advice about, okay, they might have told you this, but this is what works better. This is what actually works. And it's the same thing with bioethics. It's theory that gives you guidance and prepares you for the practice, but the practice will sharpen the theory. Bioethical principles are real. Otherwise, nobody would care about them. I mean, there would be no controversy over you should remove a feeding tube from Terry Schiavo so that she starves to death. There would be no controversy over that if the ethical principle didn't matter. It didn't matter to anybody. But it does matter. People feel strongly about it. People feel strongly. I mentioned the Dobbs decision. People felt strongly about that decision in regards to abortion, very strongly. That's an ethical issue. It's not just a medical issue. It is an ethical issue for a lot of people. Is the fetus a human person? And how, if it is, how should it be treated? How do you treat a human person? That's an ethical, moral issue. So they're real. People feel strongly. Do I want to? Well, in the article, I don't necessarily agree with this view of John French, but in the same article, Intro to Principles of Bioethics, John French says that in healthcare there really are no absolute rights or wrongs, that the specifics of any situation can vary considerably. So but I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there are actions that are always right and always wrong to do, regardless of the specifics. The specifics are going to kind of tell you which way you should go. But he doesn't think that that's the case. He thinks that what is required for a healthcare practitioner, a healing professional, is the ability to understand the ethical implications of each scenario and use that understanding to assist in developing a course of care. Okay, so it seems to be more of a situational ethic. You understand the situation and that will guide your system of care for the patient, which I don't necessarily agree with, because I don't think the situation is determinative. Nevertheless, failure to do this may result in patient dissatisfaction. If you don't engage in ethical reflection or an ethical understanding or some understanding of how to give the appropriate care to the person, again, he reiterates that failure may result in patient dissatisfaction, substandard care, that you're not caring for the whole person, and outcomes, and conflict or potential legal action. You did something to the patient that they considered was not ethical treatment of them. In summary, a good patient care requires an understanding of ethics. But I think that his view kind of, when he says that, well, there are really no rights and wrongs, that you just deal with the specifics of the scenario, I think that is dangerous because it can make ethics into a kind of airy-fairy, unreal sort of thing that can be manipulated to each situation. Aren't there any standards? There have to be some standards that are going to govern you. So, because you are going to encounter very different situations, and a standard helps you to be consistent in how you're doing it. Because you can have a million different situations and you can kind of lose sight of what your principles are if you don't have a standard. So that's where I would disagree with French's viewpoint. And for Catholic healthcare, there certainly are absolute rights and wrongs. In other words, there are things that can never be done under any circumstance. There are essential guiding principles which should always govern how the patient is ethically treated. Why? Well, the bedrock, it would be the dignity of the human person, because you're always dealing with a human person. That situation never changes. Okay, and so the person has dignity, has value, has rights. The person that you're dealing with has a conscience, has freedom and responsibility, all of these things. These are the assumptions for Catholic bioethics. You might not agree with them, but I'm just telling you what they are. And therefore, that never changes. And so there would be things that I could never do to a human person just based on their dignity. So there are essential guiding principles. This should be noted because some ethical systems don't care whether an act is right or wrong. It's the question of, can you do it? and how much pleasure will it produce. If it produces enough pleasure for enough people, then the action can be deemed good or morally ethical, that you can do it. Does it produce good results? Bioethics is a combination of two words, bios and ethos. Bios means life, meaning way of living, but ethos means custom, and that's where we get our word ethics from. So it is a form of ethics. There are two types of ethics we should be aware of, because that governs the kind of ethical theories that people will use for finding their principles. I'll talk later about what the Catholic Church's principles are, but I want to talk about these systems that you will encounter sometimes in the textbooks that you might use that deal with bioethics or nursing ethics or medical ethics. We're going to look in a general way at ethical systems that inform how one might make a decision about what is right or wrong to do, what can be done or ought not to be done, also what makes for human health and flourishing. And then second, we're going to look specifically at attempts to apply ethical principles. So if we ask the philosophers, and ethics is a form of philosophy, and remember bioethics is a subset of applied ethics, which comes under philosophy. Ethical systems can generally be grouped into two classes, deontological and teleological. And under deontological, we have duty ethics. Under teleological, we have virtue ethics, and I guess you could say pleasure ethics, but that's more my terminology. That's not really what philosophers would call it, but they call it hedonism, but we'll get to that later. Just want to make sure if I do that. Yeah, I do. Deontological ethics. A definition of deontological ethics in general, an ethico-moral theory which maintains that the rightness or wrongness of an action exists in the action itself, apart from the person's intention. Okay, so my intention does not change the nature of the action. There is an objective value to an action. So, for example, killing the innocent, killing an innocent person, a person who doesn't deserve killing. Let's put it that way, because we do have capital punishment in some states. People do accept the ethicity of capital punishment. So let's put it that way. A person who doesn't deserve killing, that's generally, apart from my intention, that is generally seen as not something that should be done. In general, okay, not everyone agrees on everything, so. The goodness or the wrongness of the action, the wrongness, for example, of killing someone who doesn't deserve to be killed, the killing of the innocent, taking the life of the innocent, is wrong whatever my intention is. It's not a good thing. My intention, my intention was good. I killed this person because he was going to kill another person. All right, that doesn't make killing necessarily a good thing, but it does contextualize why it was done, and that can relate to questions of responsibility, guilt for what you've done. For example, in self-defense, where you have a right to defend your own life, which might include having to kill the person who's trying to kill you. It doesn't have to, but it might. Okay, that doesn't de facto make the act of killing the innocent a good thing, but it does contextualize why it was done, the intention. Deontological comes from the Greek word deon, which means that which is binding or needful. It also can mean duty, your duty or obligation. As an adverb, deontos, adverb, it means doing something as it ought to be done. So doing things in the right way. And that's something that deontological ethics is very big on. It's not just doing the right thing, but you do it in the right way. Deontological ethics is concerned with the notion of duty and what is right to do. An action's rightness or wrongness, An action's rightness or wrongness derives from the very character of the act. It's intrinsic to the action. The word intrinsic means within itself. The rightness or wrongness is within the action itself. Within itself. Itself. Intra secus is a combination of two Latin words, intra and secus, within itself. Teleological ethics focuses on the end or the goal of the action, that the rightness or wrongness exists in the end for which the person does it. And that's exactly what the Greek word telos means. It means an end, a goal, a purpose. And it explains the rightness or the wrongness of an action in terms of the good or bad state of affairs that occurs because of the action's outcome. So why are you doing something? In deontological ethics, we start with duty ethics. And the person who kind of put duty ethics on the map is this gentleman, Immanuel Kant, or Kant. You can see when he lived 1724 to 1804. He was a Prussian-German philosopher. Sometimes they'll just say he was a German philosopher, but technically he was from the Empire of Prussia, which here's a little map in case you're curious where Prussia was. It doesn't exist anymore, but this is Central Europe. And so you see this would have been Poland. Poland didn't exist at the time. So you had all this blue, darkish blue, kind of purplish blue is the Empire of Prussia. And it kind of melds into and combines with, I think it was called the German Empire. But anyways, which would be modern day Germany. Whoops. There we go. See, clever monkey. I'm figuring you out, my friend. All right. And he was from Prussia, and he was of German descent. He is the most famous theoretician of what is called deontological ethics, which is commonly characterized by applying strict moral rules and norms to concrete cases. There's a picture of him. I'm assuming it's accurate. I believe it's when he was alive, so I'm assuming it's an accurate portrait of what he looked like. It's consistent with other pictures I've seen of him. If you want to go to the source of where Kant outlines his deontological view, he wrote a number of books, and I could mention them, but I'll just mention this one because it's essential. Is his 1785 book? It goes by different names, but the translation that you'll find in the public domain on the internet is The Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Ethics. So fundamental principles, or groundwork, as he calls it in German, could be translated groundwork for a metaphysics of ethics. Metaphysics is the basis of reality. It's just a fancy word for the basis of reality. If you study physics as part of your healthcare degree, as you probably do have to, physics studies the physical world, nature. Studies the natural laws, the laws by which nature operates. Metaphysics is beyond physics. What underlies that? Where does it come from? It's asking those types of questions. So he's looking for a basis for where ethics come from in this book. He searched for the supreme principle of morality based on human reason that would lead the human passions rather than following human passions or emotions. It's another word we could use for it. And the supreme principle would bind all people. Now, to give you just a little background on his philosophy, because you won't understand otherwise, Kant believed in what were called transcendentals. Kant believed that human consciousness presupposed orderly experience. Someone sent me a message. And orderly experience presupposed that there were universal and necessary laws. In other words, transcendentals. There were transcendental categories that could be applied objectively. Okay, so these were concepts not subject to proof, either by logic or by sense experience. Now, this is in philosophy, so you might say, well, that's nonsense, but you have them in science as well. They're called postulates, or There are things, there are laws, there are things that are in physics, for example, going back to our friend physics, that are simply indemonstrable. They're just accepted. And one of those things is kind of sharing with Kant's view of the world. Scientists accept that there's an orderly universe, but they don't explain where that order comes from or how it exists. They just accept that it's there. The laws of physics are the same here on planet Earth as they are billions of light years away. Now, why is that? That's the question metaphysics asks. Physicists don't ask that question. They just accept it as a postulate. It's just something that's beyond rational proof. Without it, you can't do physics. You can't do natural science. You just have to accept it. You have to accept that the experiment that a chemist runs in her lab can be replicated in a lab on the other side of the planet by another person. That's part of the basis of science. How that work? Why should that work? Because there are universal laws at work. Kant would call those in the philosophical realm, would call those transcendentals. And you see what the word transcendental means, something that surpasses or excels. Just literally, it means to climb across something. So something that transcends kind of stands or climbs across the world, if you will, or something else. So that's what a transcendental is. It's an overall category, an overarching category, which never changes, by which you can make judgments. You can apply the transcendental categories objectively because they are overarching. Again, we assume these things already. I mean, for example, I asked you, Mr. Thatch, what is that?
Color red.
The color red, sir. Is it the color red? How do you know that, sir?
I just do.
You just do. Good answer. How would you prove to someone that it's the color red? If someone asks you the question, you say that's the color red, I say it's the color blue. Prove it to me. You want? Okay, good, Mr. Thatch. Yes, Mr. Saravo.
You would have to get other people to get 20 people, and if they all say it's red, then it's probably red.
Okay. What if they're all colorblind? And they say blue is red and red is blue? So majority rules. So if you get 20 people and the majority say that's the color red, you can be pretty sure that's the color red. Okay. You get a bunch of people who see an animal and they say, oh, that's an elephant. And then you find out later that 15 of those people have never seen an elephant before in their lives. Of course, they probably have, but I'll just say an elephant. But yeah, I mean, I use the example of the color red, but you could ask, what is time? What is time? You use the word all the time. But explain it to me.
It's like a schedule.
A schedule. What does that mean?
A certain like where you have to be, how your day goes. That's how you go. Time.
Okay, a schedule might be based on time, though, isn't it? Yeah, but it's based on time. But it presumes that there's time.
Mm-hmm.
But what is time? It's almost time to go. And I'm looking, we have a clock, which is just a creation, a human creation. It's a convention. I mean, it doesn't, you don't necessarily, the clocks are different. We use these things, we understand them. These are categories we use: redness, time, age, life. But Kant would say these are based on transcendental categories that define, that are not necessarily provable by sense experience or rational experience, but are something we already know. Therefore, they exist. They must exist because we use them all the time. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday. Have a good day.
Do we have any homework for today?
Homework?
Right.
Shame on you, sir.
Yeah.
No, follow the look at the syllabus. The syllabus will gives the schedule, and it will let you know, from each week. See, gentlemen, let you know from week to week what you should be or have read.
All right.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome,
Have a
sir.
good day.
You too.
Later on when you get off on the
Thank you.
I feel like right after the lunch. Thank you. I was looking for okay.
Have my name in the attendance?
Ms. Taya Zoheda? Yes, I got you.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I took a picture of the driver just in case.
So
Okay. Whoops. Gotta stop. Stop my video. Goodbye, whoever's watching.